Thank you. So there's been this really heated topic on the internet lately, and many people are very angry about it. That seems to be the default emotion on the internet, but it seems silly, but it's actually a pretty big deal. It's a sign of something very big. It all starts in 1994 in Redmond, Washington, on the campus of Microsoft. And everybody who works for Microsoft is scrambling to prepare for the launch of their new operating system, Windows 95. You've heard of it. This is going to be big. It's going to revolutionize personal computing. Microsoft wants to get a copy of this operating system in a computer in every home and every business in the United States and throughout the world. And they have this huge launch planned. There's going to be television commercials on every channel with Rolling Stones songs playing. And they're going to light up the Empire State Building with Windows 95 colors. And they have this big launch event planned, and Jay Leno is going to host it. So along with Windows 95, they're working on this program that's going to guide people through their new computers. And this program has a little talking cartoon dog, and it talks with little talk bubbles, like you see in comic books. And this talking cartoon dog is going to say, hey, you've got new email. By the way, here's what email is. It's 1994. People don't know what email is so much. And Vincent Conair, who, besides having a really cool name, is a type designer at Microsoft at the time. He makes fonts. And he gets an early copy of this piece of software, and he's got a problem with the talking cartoon dog. The problem is the font. The talking cartoon dog is talking in Times New Roman. You're probably familiar with Times New Roman. If you've ever written a paper that was 10 pages long, and then you put it in Times New Roman, suddenly it became 8 pages long. But Mr. Conair's problem with Times New Roman wasn't so much that it was too narrow. The problem was that, talking cartoon dogs don't talk in Times New Roman. Everybody knows that. Times New Roman is way too formal. It's a serif font. It's completely wrong for talking cartoon dogs. No, talking cartoon dogs do not talk in Times New Roman. Talking cartoon dogs talk in a comic book font. But a comic book font didn't exist. So Mr. Conair was going to have to make one. So he very hastily, before the launch of Windows 95, drew out little letters that he saw in the comic book, and thus created the font that is the source of all this anger. And that font is Comic Sans, right? I don't even need a visual or any slides for you to know about this. It is infamous. There are constantly examples of Comic Sans being used in inappropriate ways. There was the basketball coach that wrote an angry letter using Comic Sans. There was the Higgs-boson subatomic particle announced in Comic Sans. And recently, the Vatican even released an interactive booklet commemorating their exiting pope in Comic Sans. But poor Mr. Conair, he never intended for Comic Sans to be used in these ways. It was a mistake. It was an accident. You see, he finished it in time for Windows 95, but the talking cartoon dog never got to talk in Comic Sans. You see, since Times New Roman was so narrow that the bubbles that had been made for the lettering, Comic Sans didn't fit in them, and there wasn't enough time to change them. But Comic Sans went ahead and shipped with Windows 95, just as it would have had it actually fit in the bubbles. And Windows 95 was a huge success, right? It remains the most successful launch of an operating system ever. Before too long, nearly every computer manufacturer was shipping with Windows 95. Before too long, it was on almost every computer worldwide. With Windows 95, the personal publishing revolution really hit a tipping point. And so then something happened along with that. People started making things. They were making more things than ever before. They were writing emails, and they were sending letters, and they were making birthday party invitations for their children, and they were making bake sale flyers for their churches. And they said to themselves, rightfully so, Children's birthday party invitations aren't in Times New Roman. Bake sale flyers aren't in Helvetica. GeoCities pages aren't in Garamond. So what did they choose? Comic Sans. But they weren't just making baby announcements and signs for lemonade stands and posters for tricycle races. They were also making programs for funerals and warning signs for electricity plants and signs that go up in a hospital that remind you to get your prostate exam. And people started to say to themselves, you know, angry letters should be written in Garamond, and subatomic particles should be announced in Helvetica, and like rock band logos should be in some sort of like jagged type font that just like rocks, right? These things aren't in Comic Sans, and people need to stop making them in Comic Sans, these people say. And that's the source of this anger. There are people who are saying Comic Sans is empirically terrible, never use it, not even for a children's coloring book. And for every 1,000 or so people that say that, there's at least one person, at least the person who made that thing, saying, you know, I happen to like Comic Sans, and I don't really care what you think. Besides, it's just a font. And this topic continues to intensify. With each passing year, more people search for Comic Sans hate. It's true. Than they did the year before. And you know what? It might not seem like it, but this is a huge deal. This is a great achievement in humanity that we can even be having a discussion like this. So if we go back about 500 years to southern Germany, there's a guy named Johannes Gutenberg. And he has this killer idea for a business. It's going to make a ton of money. So he borrows a bunch of money, and he hires a couple dozen people to work in his workshop. And he tests, and he toils, and he tinkers for 15 long years. And he cuts out thousands of tiny little letters and perfects the technology for Europe's first printing press and to produce the first printed Bible. Well, this Bible was big. It was, here, it was as big as this book. Actually, it would have been 2 volumes of this book. It weighed as much as a Cocker Spaniel. And it wasn't cheap either. Normal people like you and me couldn't afford it. In fact, the clerks who used this, it would be 3 years' salary just to buy one. That didn't matter quite so much because we couldn't read it anyway. Most of us were too busy toiling in the fields for our feudal lords or dying of strep throat or cholera to be concerned with knowing how to read. Reading was reserved only for a privileged few. But Gutenberg's Bible and printing press changed all of that. It's considered the greatest invention of the modern era. And it seems really obvious in retrospect, but really think about this. Printing and publishing in books made it so that you could have an idea, and then you could store it somewhere, and then I could put that idea in my brain, and then I could say, hey, I like that idea, and then I could put that in like another book, and then other people could read that. We could do that over and over again on a wide scale. Printing and publishing networked people's brains. And so eventually people did learn how to read. And within a couple hundred years, the Age of Enlightenment started. We started using the scientific method, and we developed antibiotics to cure our strep throat, and we formed governments that weren't based on feudalism, and we developed all sorts of other innovations like electricity and computers and the internet and Windows 95 and Comic Sans. And all the things that we had to invent so that all of us could gather today and to share more ideas. But before the personal publishing revolution, before Windows 95, before Comic Sans, most of the printing, most of the publishing, most of the making wasn't done by regular people. It was done by craftspeople who had to study for years and learn about typography and cut out little letters, or choose little letters cut out by another craftsperson that were appropriate for the content and the context. The tools weren't widely available, and the barrier to entry was higher. Fewer people were doing it. Fewer people were publishing, fewer people were designing. Just like it was when Gutenberg's Bible came out. The tool, the book, wasn't widely available. Few people could read. And Vincent Conaire was one of those craftspeople. He tried to make the font that was right for the content and the context. It didn't really turn out the way that he expected. I mean, he's even said that he's embarrassed that his career is associated with this font. It's just used in these ways that he never anticipated. It seems really obvious in retrospect, but when you're revolutionizing personal publishing, people are going to use your font. He just didn't have a conception, really, of what a big audience he was actually designing for. And now, each of us is one of these craftspeople. Each of us can make things for other people to see on a widespread scale. So we're not just scribbling our banana bread recipes on an index card and putting it in a little box on our kitchen counter. We're making a blog so everybody can try our recipes. And we're not just opening a lemonade stand, we're doing a Kickstarter campaign for a new health drink. We're not just singing alone to ourselves in our room. We're cutting an album, we're making cover art for that album. But with this new power comes new obstacles, and there are two big ones. The first one is that the more people there are who are making things, the harder it is to get your thing into someone else's brain. I can access millions of Gutenberg Bibles worth of information with this little thing. And not only is this a book, it's also a printing press. Ideas are transferred from one brain to another billions of times a day with these little things. So if you want to get your idea into other people's brains, it's going to have to really connect with them. Which brings me to the other thing. And that is that when you're making things for other people, what you like and what feels comfortable to you isn't always going to be what they like. And I might have liked to come give this talk in my pajamas. I mean, that's what I was wearing when I wrote it, anyway. But when you make things for other people, you communicate with more than just your content. And it's not always as simple as just choosing the right font. There's colors and shapes and lines and textures. All these things say things about the things that we make. And it's the shapes and lines that people are taking issue with Comic Sans. They're saying, you know, I really don't want the brochure from my surgeon to look like it was scribbled by a child. These elements of visual language are in all the things that we make. They're in the logo for your startup. They're in your album cover. They're in the grant proposal for your research. They're in the presentation that you're pitching to your boss. They're in all the things that we make. And it used to be that this language of design, was only understood by a few talented craftspeople. It was reserved only for a privileged few. But that's all changed. The tools are widely available. The barrier to entry is lower. More people are doing it. More people are making things. More people are designing. And I think there's always going to be a place for people who are really great at design, just like there's still a place for people who are really great at writing. But I think it's time for the literacy of design to start spreading. I remember when I was in grade school, I had pretty good grades in every subject except handwriting. I mean, I could draw letters, but I couldn't write them. And as much as I complained, my teachers always told me that if I was going to be successful, I better learn how to communicate clearly. And so that's why I had to have good handwriting. And, well, fortunately, I don't have to write things that much anymore. We don't really write things anymore. We make things, and we communicate with typography and colors and lines. And all these things say things about the things that we make. And we should be learning about this visual language. This should be ingrained in our culture. It's not just going to help you with your album cover or your documentary film. It's going to help the engineer present life-saving data to stakeholders on a project. It's going to help the entrepreneur raise money for the next world-changing idea. It's going to help governments create documents that allow them to operate more efficiently, which you can appreciate if you've ever tried to do your own taxes. We're learning about these things already. There's a lot of people who think that maybe they just don't get design, that only certain people with special talents can even learn about it at all. But I don't really think so. I stood up here and named maybe half a dozen typefaces with no visual aids whatsoever, and I saw nodding heads all around the room from people who probably wouldn't call themselves designers. And you were picturing those typefaces in your heads, and that wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. That wouldn't have happened before the personal publishing revolution, before Windows 95. That wouldn't have happened before the great Comic Sans debate. We're learning about these things already. We're hardly even aware of it. Keep in mind, Gutenberg's Bible was printed over 500 years ago. Now we know how to read and write. It's going to seem so obvious in retrospect, but it's happening right under our noses. All this silly complaining over a silly little font is evidence of that. It's happening anyway, so I feel like we should be intentional about it. If we want to get our ideas into other people's brains, we need a new kind of literacy, the literacy of design. And I think that we have everything that we need to make it happen, so I hope that we'll pursue it. Thank you.